Suntem în anul 4 de când rușii au declanșat războiul total asupra Ucrainei și este peste un deceniu de când Federația Rusă este supusă sancțiunilor internaționale. Nivelul de măsuri luate împotriva țării agresive a crescut treptat, dar încă mai este loc de presiune. Dar s-a făcut totuși o greșeală, explică invitatul meu de astăzi, Tom Kittinge, de la Royal United Services Institute. Liderii internaționali au sugerat că sancțiunile vor avea un efect imediat și vor funcționa brusc asupra economiei ruse, ca un întrerupător de lumină, însă n-a fost chiar așa. Dar efectele se resimt deja, iar economia rusă scârție. Toate detaliile imediat. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport Diplomatic. Tom Kittinge, Director of the Center for Finance and Security at RUSI. Welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you very much for having me.
We are talking today about sanctions and the effects of the international sanctions, and of course we'll take the example of the Russian Federation. Since they started the illegal war in Ukraine, all the world, let's say, imposed the sanction on Russia. How does it work? What are the effects of these sanctions normally?
Well, you made an important point there, which is you said all the world have put sanctions on Russia, but actually part of the problem is all the world have not. Historically, sanctions have been agreed at the United Nations, and of course then that is a matter of international law. And what sanctions are typically trying to do is to kind of use economic pressure to change the behavior of a belligerent state or change the behavior of a terrorist group or something like that. In the case of Russia, of course, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, so it's not going to agree sanctions on itself, and therefore a community has had to come together, led by the United States, the EU and the UK, to design sanctions to try and pressure the Russian state into reversing its illegal invasion of Ukraine, and specifically trying to restrict the funding and the resourcing of the Russian military.
And does these sanctions work so far? Because Russia seems to have enough money to continue the war, but does Russia have enough money for its own citizens?
Yeah, so do sanctions work is sort of a big academic question. I think a mistake that Ukraine's allies made at the beginning of the full-scale invasion was to overpromise what sanctions could achieve. Sanctions were never going to stop the Russian tanks. What sanctions were going to do is slowly strangle the Russian economy. And that process is going on. If you look at the rate of inflation in Russia, if you look at the level of interest rates, if you look at the amount of money that Russia has to pay extra to buy goods from overseas. So we have thrown some friction into the machine. So the sanctions are having an impact. Of course, the missiles are still flying, the drones are still crashing into cities in Ukraine every night. And this is why we're at a critical moment right now. We have to maintain the pressure. The Russian economy is creaking, there's no doubt about that. And we need to keep pushing, because we need to basically make Vladimir Putin make a choice. Do you support your people as president of the Russian Federation, or do you continue to prosecute a crazy war in Ukraine? And I think that point is coming.
You are quite optimistic because there is a big debate at the level of European Union this time to use or not to use the Russian frozen assets. For the moment, Ukraine is benefiting by the interest of those assets, but according to the international law, it would be illegal as well to use the Russian money that are frozen in European banks. What is the best answer to that question?
I think the story of the Russian central bank assets is a very interesting one, and I think we have reached a critical moment. So just to explain, every 6 months the EU sanctions have to be renewed by a unanimous decision within the European Union. And we know that certain countries like Hungary and Slovakia are spoilers in that discussion. So in July there will be the next moment where it is decided whether or not to continue to freeze the Russian central bank assets. And to be clear, we're talking about 200 billion euros in Europe, another 100 billion elsewhere around the world. And that money is sitting there. It belongs to Russia still. And I think many people, myself included, would argue that that money should benefit Ukraine to a great extent. So yes, the profits on that money are being used to support Ukraine, but we should clearly go further. And so over the coming months, I would like to see the EU be more radical in the way it thinks about these assets. A lot of people are concerned about the legal arguments, about if you confiscated the assets, would that somehow undermine the integrity of the euro? I think those arguments are spurious. At the end of the day, Russia has illegally invaded Ukraine, and there is a penalty and a price to pay for that, and one of the penalties and one of the prices is losing its right to those assets.
There are different types of sanctions imposed to Russia. First is to the state itself, to the Russian Federation. Then we have people that are under sanctions, and as well there are private companies. How do those work? I mean, why those differences?
So there are three main types of sanction on Russia. First, there are the sanctions on the Russian banks, the financial system, to try and block access to using the financial system, raising money in the financial system, certainly in the West, in Europe and the US. The second are the sanctions on imports. So Russia needs critical technologies in order to support its military. And those technologies come from the European Union, they come from the United States. They also, unfortunately, come from places like China that are not part of the sanctions coalition. And then the third group of sanctions are the sanctions on exports, primarily oil and gas. Russia needs to raise money by selling its energy around the world. And so that's really been the focus of the international community. And in the context of that, there are companies that act as selling oil or procuring technology from around the world. And those really are the target of the sanctions. You mentioned people as well. It's also important to signal to the heads of defense companies, to oligarchs, to those that are close to the Kremlin and benefit from the Kremlin's support, that the support for the Kremlin is not acceptable, and therefore, as a result, you don't get a visa to come into Schengen, you don't get to use your house in London, you don't get to use your money that you store in a bank account in France. And so, really, this is trying to put a whole ring around Russia, squeeze those who are close to the Kremlin, squeeze the way in which Russia funds and resources its military, and we hope eventually change President Putin's mind.
Again, I will tell you that you are optimistic in this sense, because, let's say, knowing Russia in a different way from this corner of the world, we know that Russia is quite able to find ways to avoid this type of sanctions. And for instance, they replaced the pipeline oils that were used to send gas and oil to the Western Europe before the war with tanker oil ship selling to various other countries in a different way, a sort of a shadow fleet. They have it all over the world on the seas. Are these type of sanctions work for this type of solutions that Russia is finding?
So you say that I'm optimistic. I think my optimism is based on wanting and desiring Ukraine's allies to continue pressure. That's the point. We shouldn't give up, I think. Absolutely, is more my message. And the point you raise about the shadow fleet and about the way Russia adapts more generally to sanctions is why we shouldn't give up. Because at the end of the day, for Russia, avoiding sanctions, setting up new relationships, finding new markets, it's existential. If it doesn't do that, the lights go out in Russia and the Putin administration collapses. And so for the Russians, they are constantly looking for ways to work around the sanctions, to be dynamic and shapeshift. The problem that we have in the West is our decision-making is very, very slow, and we're nervous about damaging our own economy. And so whilst Russia and the Kremlin view avoiding sanctions as existential, Russia feels it is at economic war with the West, we don't have the same mindset. And of course the result is, unfortunately, yes, the Russians come up with very elaborate schemes to avoid the sanctions. That's why we need to be persistent and not give up.
And what shall we do with the countries that are taking advantage of these sanctions imposed, as you said, by a part of the world, not entire world? I was wrong there. They take advantage and they buy cheaper products from Russian Federation.
So this is the art of the diplomats who are jetting around the world to try and talk to countries in Central Asia, countries in the Middle East, countries in Southeast Asia. I think we have to be very careful. It's a very colonial mindset to arrive in a country and say, we've decided something in Brussels or London or Washington, and you need to follow what we do. In this day and age, in a multipolar world, countries will say, well, I'm not interested in having that conversation. I will go and build relationships with India or with China instead of with Europe or the United States. So we need to have a more sophisticated conversation. I think the conversation that we need to have with these countries is to make them understand the nature of the war in Ukraine. It's an illegal invasion. And then make them understand what we want them to do. We don't want them to stop buying oil from Russia. I mean, it would be nice, but that's unrealistic. But we want them to stop exporting critical components, technology components, the components that Russia needs to replenish its war machine. So I think it's more a conversation of explaining how those countries can help stop the war in Ukraine, support innocent people in Ukraine, rather than you need to follow everything that we are doing.
But now it's time of practicality in the foreign affairs, the way we see it coming from Washington to the rest of the world. On the other hand, we have the countries you mentioned, China and India, who are practical by default because in Asia it's a different mindset. Do you think that we will be able to get there and to convince them that people are much more important than gaining some access to the Black Sea, for instance?
What the diplomats say is that there is understanding in these countries that this trade is supporting the illegal war. I think we have to allow them to come to the right decision, but come to the right decision in their own way. I think what we can't do is be seen to be pressuring them. Now, we do have harder tools that we can use. So, for example, the EU has a whole range of sanctions tools that it can use against companies in China or in India or in the Middle East, or against banks in those regions that are facilitating procurement of goods for Russia's military. And we're possibly at a stage now, obviously, we all hope that Vladimir Putin will come to the negotiation table, will agree a ceasefire, that the ceasefire will hold, that will lead to a peace deal. And I think that now might be the time to actually use some of those more powerful tools to pressure Russia, pressure those that are perhaps more easily able to talk to Russia, that honestly, after 3 years, it's high time that there was a ceasefire and there was peace. But it's a delicate, I think, diplomatic dance. And one of the mistakes that international leaders made in February 2022 was to suggest that sanctions were going to be an instant solution and were going to basically shut the Russian economy off overnight like a light switch. That was never going to happen. That was a mistake, and we are living with that mistake, I think, still.
Because you mentioned as well the ceasefire negotiations, Donald Trump is trying hardly to bring Vladimir Putin to the table of negotiations, and he also mentioned the fact that perhaps the United States could impose even harsher sanctions to the Russian Federation. Do you have any idea of this type of sanctions for the public to understand?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier in the conversation this question of the shadow fleet. So just to explain that, so essentially when oil tankers move around the world, they need to fly under a flag of Panama, Greece, whatever it might be, but also importantly they need to be insured. They need to have the right insurance because disasters happen. And what's happened in relation to sanctions is that Western insurance companies, Western providers of services to the shipping industry have cut those services. So now we have these tankers floating around the world with maybe no insurance. They're sort of time bombs. If one of those breaks up, and they're old tankers, they're past their lifetime. So we know that Russia is really struggling to maintain the export of its oil. That is the Achilles heel of Russia. That is what we should be going after. In the dying days of the Biden administration put heavy sanctions on the Russian shadow fleet. I expected Donald Trump to continue to follow that. So far, he's done nothing. But that, in a way, is a loaded gun that the United States could fire at Russia. And as I say, that is the big vulnerability that Russia faces, is if we are able to shut down its ability to export its oil via the shadow fleet, then quite quickly, I think, Vladimir Putin would feel the pressure.
Well, actually, Donald Trump did something. It was an exemption from the sanctions done by Joe Biden administration. It expired recently, and it's about the fact that Russians were allowed to use some U.S. financial system in order to manage their oil transactions in U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
The Trump administration, because that term expired, just let it be. So Russia will not perhaps be able to transaction its oil using U.S. dollars. Will this work? And what type of effects shall we expect from something like that?
Yeah, so I know the case you're referring to. It's basically a waiver that was not renewed.
Yeah.
There are a very great many people in my world and in ministries of foreign affairs across Europe who are sort of watching for signs from the White House. And everyone has picked up on that and said, oh, well, actually, maybe Trump will be harder on Putin with sanctions than perhaps we feared. It's an interesting sign. It's an interesting signal. I think what we need, though, is we need, in a way, Donald Trump to be making some very overt, some very direct decisions around the shadow fleet. Interestingly, on the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale invasion, the EU and the UK put new sanctions on the Russian shadow fleet. The Americans did not. The Americans actually targeted the Iranian shadow fleet that day. So I think the US has some catching up to do in that regard. And if the US is willing to pressure the Russian shadow fleet with sanctions, I think that will make a tremendous difference. Now, the concern, of course, the United States has is that might push up the oil price. We know that in the United States, politics is very sensitive to the cost of putting gas in your car. So there's a consideration there. But I think, frankly, we know that Donald Trump is not a patient man. And I think if he loses patience with Vladimir Putin, I would expect to see heavy sanctions on the shadow fleet.
You are British. United Kingdom is extremely harsh when it comes to Russian Federation. It's a different approach perhaps than the European Union has. It's a more tougher one. Is United Kingdom now working in a better way with the European Union for sanctioning Russia?
One of the things that we hear quite often when we visit Brussels to have meetings with the European Union officials is they say, you know, Tom, the only file in Brussels where you don't feel Brexit is the sanctions file. I think there is very close collaboration. We had a new government in the UK last summer, in July, a new Labour government. Yep. It's clear that Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, sees sanctions as an area for collaboration, for rapprochement with the EU. And certainly we find ourselves getting involved in conversations that reflect that. We hold conferences in Brussels bringing British officials and EU officials together. So I think it is a great area of collaboration. We've heard during our visit to Bucharest in the last few days, we've heard about that collaboration as well. So I think, yes, it's an area where we can all agree. I think the one thing I would say is, of course, the UK does not have such close economic ties and particularly energy ties with Russia. So in a way, the UK can afford to be tougher. If you're a European country that buys your energy from Russia, you've got some much more difficult decisions to make.
And since you mentioned that you've heard some things about that in Bucharest, please explain to us your job in Bucharest. What have you done here, and how is Romania reacting when it comes to sanctions imposed on Russian Federation?
So over the last 3 years, we've run a project where we visit different European Union member states and try and understand how those states are handling the implementation of sanctions. It's important to remember that in the EU, sanctions are decided in Brussels, but then passed over to member states for implementation. So it's Romanian banks, it's Romanian companies that have to then take what's decided in Brussels and implement that on Romanian soil and with Romanian companies. The interesting thing is that also in those visits is we get a sense of the passion for sanctions in these countries. So if you go to Latvia or Lithuania or Czech Republic or Poland, they're very passionate. They want more sanctions. They want the sanctions to be tougher. In Romania, there's not a lot of talk about sanctions. No one would doubt Romania's commitment to supporting Ukraine. After all, you are neighbours. But we've been surprised by the lack of kind of interest in talking about the topic in the way that you might hear in other states that kind of border the conflict zone. On the flip side, of course, Romania is the advocate for Moldova in the European Union, and there are also sanctions related to Moldova in the EU. So, you know, if I was kind of as an objective observer, maybe Romania is using its powder in Brussels to push for sanctions related to destabilizing activity by Russia in Moldova, and is basically supportive but not necessarily vocal when it comes to sanctions on Russia.
Well, we'll hope people will see this interview and have a different approach. Thank you so much for this talk.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina noastră de Facebook și pe conturile de X și Instagram ale emisiunii. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!